Welcome back to another episode of Man v Mob. I'll keep this one short and sweet this week. So, I am reading a book called 10 Global Trends Every Smart Person Should Know. And it is actually really refreshing because, as I've talked about before, uh, news is essentially bad news. It's a collection of all of the worst things, and where the lizard part of our brain is attracted to that because we like to, sense danger so that we can know what to respond to. But it was not built to prepare itself for the modern world where every threat on the planet, everywhere at once, is being funneled into our heads. So, we're overstressed, we're extremely anxious, depressed, I think, as a pretty clear direct result of that flow of negative information. But this book actually has positive trends. And if you think about it, the positive change that occurs is more gradual and it's more difficult to see at a glance, which is why we tend to have a negativity bias. And this book really provides, although it's called 10 global trends everyone should know, it actually focuses on 7 categories. And so there's 10 trends within each category. One of them might be agriculture, another would be health. And they're all really good things that are going on. And I highly recommend that you either find a copy of this book at your local library or pick it up at a Barnes and Noble or order it on Amazon. But it is really something that you should show to other people and read yourself, because it's a reminder that not everything is as bleak as is constantly portrayed, and that a lot of people are very cynical right now, and they have these sort of, you almost get the impression that they have, I don't know, like an Armageddon fantasy or something like that. So they really validate themselves by getting the sense of the world is nigh. And sometimes it's because they want to say that they themselves have the answers, but it's really not as bleak as is often portrayed. Are there threats? Are there things to worry about? Sure, but it's not the constant barrage of endless threat and crisis that is portrayed. So, another thing that I wanted to bring up, and this is related to the debate that was last night, the first presidential debate, and there was a question where President Trump was asked if he would denounce white supremacy, and he once again didn't do so. Just like with Charlottesville, there are good people on both sides. There wasn't a clear stated rebuke. He also has done this before with the would you denounce the Ku Klux Klan? And I believe that first one was sort of a cynical realization that the Louisiana primary, or whatever system Louisiana has, was the next day, and that he would have um, potentially affected some of his votes, because even white supremacists vote if he had denounced the Klan. And I think David Duke was running, maybe. I might be mistaken on that. But anyway, the point is, um, after last night's debate and the question about white supremacy, it had me thinking again about that topic. And I've had this discussion with some friends recently. I personally believe that white supremacy should be labeled as a terrorist ideology, just like Islamic fundamentalism, Islamic terrorism. And we need to be nuanced with it, though, because I'm not sure if you've ever seen the video of Sam Harris on Bill Maher many years back, but he kind of breaks down how, with the more extreme Islamic views, there are different layers. And at the core, you have the people who advocate violence, the jihadists, and they're willing to kill people and pursue martyrdom by blowing themselves up, or uh, get their goals accomplished through violence, basically. And that is a relatively small percentage of the total population of Muslims. It's, like less than 1% or something like that. It's still a substantial number of people worldwide, maybe like, 15,000 people or something like that. But percentage wise, it's rather small. And then he says, you have to think about it like concentric circles, like a bullseye, where outside of that, you have Islamists who don't advocate violence, but they want to have their political goals accomplished by implementing Sharia law. They want political Islam, and there is a whole lot of pretty awful doctrine that comes with that. and then that might account for 5% of the Muslim population, or 5 to 10%. I don't know the exact numbers. And then you get further outside of that, and you have the um, conservative Muslims who have problematic views that really enable those other more radical smaller circles. So views about women and gays and Jews and non-believers, and what should be done with them, and how leaving their religion should be punishable by death, things like that. And so he's saying, Sam Harris in this episode was saying that all those three circles together account for up to 30% of the Islamic faith. And there is still a hell of a lot of people who don't fall in any of those categories, and who are just, casual believers, and people who are, you know, believe elements of Islam or whatever, but they don't advocate violence. They don't have prejudicial views or anything like that. And anyway, the reason I bring this up is because we really ought to consider white supremacy in the same way. There is a center of people who advocate violence and probably KKK style lynchings or beating people up or intimidation tactics. And then outside of that, you have people who are maybe like, I don't know, Richard Spencer or something like that, who's advocating some type of political revolution or pursuit of an ethno state or something like that. And then outside of that, you have like the trolls and the people who are really cynical, and the people who create sort of an environment that enables and maybe some of the sort of white supremacy adjacent ideologies, like the people who dub themselves nationalists, or maybe people who don't fully believe in or fully have racial attitudes, but they have a plethora of different kind of hardcore beliefs. So we have to be more nuanced with how we talk about these things, because if we're not, the risk is that we create fertile ground for more indoctrination. And you think about how there's criticisms of the political right and how they discuss terrorism and Islam, and how their portrayal is rather lazy and ignorant. And a lot of that is true. A lot of it often is not very researched and just overly broad in its categorization of people. And so the argument is, because of that they're inadvertently causing more recruitment in the Middle East for the cause. They're further alienating more Muslims to join and pick up arms against the United States, and Western imperialism and these other ideas, right? So that same thing, I don't understand why people haven't made this connection, but that same exact thing can be said of overly applying the category or the label of white supremacy, which, a lot of things are labeled racist or white supremacist or whatever, in things that aren't quite categorized. They say, oh, well, that's a dog whistle, and that is actually covertly white supremacy. And in some cases, obviously that's correct, but we have to be really careful here, because just like the argument with Islam, we're creating fertile ground for people who, might have problematic views, or who might have hard or radical views, to become even further radicalized, and people who are not radicalized to become further alienated and seek out validation through these only groups left who will accept them. It's the cost of these progressive purity purges that we have, where if you're not purely morally ideal all the time, which nobody is, then you're cut out of the public conversation or the public group, and it's harmful to the public conversation, and it's also harmful to the individuals that get cut out. It's harmful for everybody when we have that attitude. I personally consider this obsession with moral purity that we have today, that tends to exist more in the social justice mindset. The obsession with it it reminds me of the obsession with racial purity that existed in the mid 20th century, where it's kind of amusing how the people who advocated racial purity, even Hitler himself, didn't meet his own exacting standards of, he had Jewish heritage, he wasn't blonde and blue-eyed, so he didn't even meet his own exacting standard of like Aryan racial purity, right? So today you have the same exact thing with the moral purity that people are demanding, where people are saying you have to be absolute in your behavior and your conversation, and you have to all the time advocate pure ethics and pure morality. And the people who are saying this are often themselves guilty of violent action and intimidation and various other nefarious activities. So it's really something that I think we ought to watch out for, is how oftentimes the people who are obsessed with moralizing and considering themselves morally superior are hiding something. That was happening with the church, with pedophilia. It was happening with a lot of the Hollywood celebrities who were advocating their causes on, social media or in the press or whatever, when you found out that a lot of them were covering up the casting couch and covering up other dark parts of Hollywood. And it's happening with people on Twitter and on every form of social media, and pretty much every public forum today, where people are, I think, lacking something to believe in. So they are recreating this concept of the true believer and purity. And it's sort of a hysteria, just like the Salem witch trials, just like the Red Scare in the 50s with McCarthyism. It's a new hysteria that we're living through right now, and we need to be very cautious, because we further alienate each other, and we need absolutely to become more, we need to create a finer mesh when it comes to how we categorize people, because we have like very large, boxy, crude categorizations that are just downright lazy and reflect a lack of understanding and a lack of nuance about the world around us. And we need to make those categorizations. We have a natural tendency to categorize. I'm not saying don't categorize. That's stupid. That's like saying don't stereotype. Our brains stereotype. You can tell people don't stereotype, or be cautious about how you stereotype or question your stereotypes. But to say don't stereotype is to not acknowledge that it's a natural tendency of the human brain. So with categorizing and stereotyping and generalizing, we need to really adopt better mental models of how we see the world. And that requires effort. And it's not something that people do naturally, but it's something that we ought to focus on and that we ought to have more conversations about. And so the last things that I wanted to mention are other tendencies of the human brain that we might miss. I'm not sure how many of you really are interested in psychology or how introspective you are, but I tend to notice patterns in either group psychology or in individual psychology. Like, for example, the need for a narrative, which I've talked about before, how the brain consciousness has a tendency to pull data out of all of the mass data that our senses pick up and build a story out of it, particularly one that's satisfying to us and puts us at the center of it as like the hero, because that's one of the simplest stories that can be told, is hero versus villain. And that brings me to the next thing, which is the need for a villain. If you just look at the human history, there's always um, some type of villain, something to push against, to form yourself against. Recently in American history, it was the Soviet Union was like the great enemy. And when your enemy disappears, there's a huge identity crisis. It's like the main villain in a comic book novel disappearing, where it's just the superhero left. What exactly does the superhero do with their lives? Or what does any character or person do with their lives when their enemy is gone? I think moving forward, we need to focus less on having human enemies And of course, there are going to be villainous people, but I think we've realized, first of all, villainy is more complex, and oftentimes villainy has uh, positive intentions behind it in a complex way. You know, if you look at Thanos, and I never really watched the new Avengers movies, but the main villain in the Avengers movies, he wanted to kill half of the universe's population to, you know, create more room for the remaining population because it was like an overpopulation crisis. So like that's a moral dilemma, very complex character. Same thing with I just finished the Watchmen graphic novel, and risk of spoiling it, I won't get into details of how it's done, but one of the main characters, Ozymandias, he wants to kill a large percentage of the population of New York in an effort to inspire the two superpowers of the world, which are the Soviet Union and the United States at the time, to basically bridge their differences and unite against a common enemy that he is presenting to them, and how he kills these people. So yeah, um, there are going to be villains, real flesh and blood human villains, but we need to be careful not to needlessly create villains in the way that we treat each other, I guess, and that it might make sense to take that capacity to fight against something and put a non-human face on it, like, you know, uniting against COVID, or uniting against climate change, or uniting against misapplication of technology, or uniting against nuclear destruction, stuff like that. Is it possible to have a more complex version of an enemy, a more abstract enemy than just another human being or another human group or another nation? Because that's what we should be aiming for. um, let's see, I wrote down a couple others here, a couple other basic needs that we have. Oh, of course, the need to rescue. So the need to protect somebody, the need to feel like you're saving someone, sort of a messiah complex that can turn into when it's overly used. And we can be very patronizing if we're not careful with this need. And you see this a lot, unfortunately, today, where you have one group that dubs itself the protector of the other group and says they have the other group's best interests in mind, and it becomes a very paternalistic um, sort of looking down on the other relationship. And another another belief that we all have is the need to feel victimized. And I think that sort of bleeds into the sense of catharsis that people can seek when they try to join together for for validation, but also to get over a sense of humiliation. And this goes back to what I was talking about with being careful how we talk about terrorism or white supremacy, or anything like that. Is what inspires a lot of people to take on an attitude of supremacy, or an attitude of I'm better than somebody else, superiority, is actually ironically a sense of inferiority, or a sense of um, confusion, and particularly a sense of humiliation. Like, for example, if you look back at when the Ku Klux Klan was formed, it was in the defeat of the South after the Civil War. If you look back at when the Nazis were formed, it was in the defeat of Germany after World War One, and how the other countries sought total dismemberment, basically, of Germany, and the reparations that were sought from Germany after that. So there's certainly a lesson in not glorying in the defeat of your foe, and not overly humiliating them, because that humiliation becomes the next mortal crisis, or the next humanitarian crisis, or the next you know, empire or evil ideology. Aside from those two groups, you also have, after World War II, the whole notion of think about the Holocaust, of never forget. That tends to be behind all of these hateful ideologies that start to develop over time, or these notions of, or I guess I should say actions being taken overboard, is never forget. Never forget this humiliation that we suffered. So, like I mentioned, the KKK, I mentioned the Nazis. Actually, to an extent, obviously not as bad as the KKK or the Nazis, but Jews after World War II, after the Holocaust, and some of the attitudes and treatment of the Palestinians. Um, the various social justice warrior groups in the United States as a response to um, slavery and Jim Crow, as a response to male domination, as a response to um, LGBT suppression. And then even more newer, we're seeing a newer generation of people who grew up after the previous generation of oppression, who are now being told that they're oppressive, even though that they haven't done anything yet. And so they feel victimized, and so they're creating sort of a counterculture to the idea of the previous group sense of victimization. So you see how it kind of gets layered and repetitive. And I'm not saying every single group is equally justified in their attitudes, and obviously, like, there has been terrible mistreatment of all kinds of groups over time, and in all places. And I think we're getting better at the degree of mistreatment, and I'm hoping that we can sort of put that behind us entirely. But we still need to be very, very cautious of continuing that sense of humiliation needlessly, and what that humiliation will do to different groups, and what it will cause people to seek out in others, and how it will cause them to join and become true believers and dissolve their individual identity. Because a lot of, paired with the humiliation, I think, is a sense of self-contempt, where when people have a sense of self-contempt and they don't like their individual identity, they tend to seek solace in group identity. And so people will focus on, you look at the big issues of the 20th century, it was class, it was nationality, it was race. And three of the biggest travesties that occurred in the 20th centuries were communism, fascism, and Nazism, which is a form of fascism. But obsession with these group identities is ultimately causing people to take on problematic ideologies, but also to do things that they would never do as individuals, sort of dissolving their individual morality or sense of responsibility, and taking on the cloak of anonymity of the group, and doing whatever they believe that the group demands of them. So it's sort of like a cult mindset. And yeah, there are going to be other ways that people can escape their sense of self-contempt moving forward. I mean, in the past, it was joining groups and also just outright lying, being a compulsive liar, and forming sort of a new identity based on those lies. And then moving forward, increasingly, one of the options is going to be going into digital worlds, digital places, whether that's social media or games or alternate realities, really, to create artificial new identities and avatars. So we're going to be seeing a mix of these various things, and they're going to intertwine artificial realities and digital identities, definitely the misuse of those, as well as the joining of smaller and smaller groups, kind of fringe ideologies. You're going to see lone wolves. You're going to see people, a lot of lies too, and we're going to have to develop effective strategies for combating these things and seeing through them, and dealing with them. And the good news is, moving forward, our world is going to be very much more networked, and there's going to be a lot of opportunities, and there's going to be tons of creation and wonderful things coming. But it's also going to give more opportunities to the people with nefarious intentions as well. So it's going to empower everybody. The good news is all the people who, they have good morals and good ethics and they're creative, they're going to be empowered. And so too are the people who are amoral or nihilistic or just want to cause harm. So anyway, I'm glad I could get these things out of my head. I know not all of them go together. Let me check my phone one more time to see if I'm missing any of these thoughts that I wrote down. No, nope. I said group pride as a surrogate for self pride. Yep. Mentioned that. Self-contempt. Mentioned that. Okay. I'm good. That's everything. As always, if you have a comment on something that I brought up, don't hesitate to drop me a line, send me a message. Please subscribe to the podcast and comment on the videos or leave reviews on the various places you can leave reviews, like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, wherever you're listening to this right now. That's all I got. See you next time, everybody.